Welcome back. In the last video I showed you how to wire your receivers into your flight controller. Normally the next step would be to go into Betaflight and configure everything to get everything working, but before we do that there's a few steps that comes in between. Many guys have problems either connecting to Betaflight or being able to flash new firmware to the flight controller, or both. So that's what I want to cover in this video. And just like with every other video, I made both of these builds as different as possible to bring you as much information as possible. So let's cover this build first with the Seriously Dodo flight controller. I'm editing this video and I just wanted to let you know, if you wait until the very end of the video, I actually show you on the screen the difference between a flight controller with a virtual COM port and one with a CP2102 chipset. I also give you some tips on what not to do to make sure you don't lock yourself out of your flight controller. The Seriously Dodo has the CP2102 chipset and driver, where on the other build with the Omnibus flight controller it uses a virtual COM port. No matter what type of flight controller you have, if you have not already, go into Betaflight and you want to download the CP2100X driver, the STM USB VCP driver, and ZADEG. Once you have all three of those downloaded, unpacked, and installed, then we can continue. So I will take my USB cable, plug it into the flight controller. One thing to check is make sure that your USB cable is good and working, because I have had times where my USB cable went bad and I spent the longest time trying to figure out why it could not connect to Betaflight, and turns out it was just a bad USB cable. Now with this board, if we try to connect, we get this warning that says, warning, non-Betaflight firmware is not supported, blah blah blah. What this means is it doesn't have Betaflight firmware on it. It probably has, I would like to guess, clean flight firmware. So this will not connect until we get Betaflight firmware on it. So let's go to Firmware Flasher. In this top box we want to pick whatever flight controller you have, and for the Dodo flight controller it's going to be RMDO, which is right here. Then click on this, and typically you want to choose the newest version of firmware, but sometimes firmware does have bugs in it, so always just try the newest version of firmware. If I do find bugs in it, then I just go backwards one version of firmware until I'm trying to get everything working, and it does work. But as far as I know, I don't know if there's any problems with 3.1.7, so we'll use that. Now with the CP2102 boards like the Dodo, you need to unplug the USB cable. If you look right here, these two pads, it says boot right above it, and these are going to be your bootloader pins or pads. You need to jump both of these pads together with some type of metallic object to short them against one another, and once you plug in the USB cable, then it's going to be in the bootloader mode instead of the normal mode. I'm trying to keep the terms simple here. If I plug in my USB cable without jumping those pins, you will notice that I get a red status light. If you do jump those pins, you will not get the red status light, and that is how you know you successfully made it into the bootloader. So to do this, you can use any type of metallic tweezers. You can use a piece of scrap wire and just hold it across both of those. Just make sure the wire doesn't contact anything else. You could use a piece of solder. I mean, it's completely up to you. You just have to make both these pads shorted against one another. So I'm going to put my tweezers right on top of both these pads and then plug in my USB cable. I got the red status light, which means I wasn't holding the tweezers down right. So if I try it again, there we go, no red status light, so we are now in the bootloader. The next thing you need to know is, depending on what type of flight controller you use, some of these boxes need to be checked, sometimes they don't need to be checked. If you're not sure, then just try a bunch of different random combinations. The only one you do not have to check off is Show Unstable Releases. So if I click Load Firmware Online, give it a second, and once it's downloaded I can flash firmware. It will say contacting bootloader and no response from the bootloader, programming failed. So, and before you start turning on these boxes, you have to click off of the screen and then go back to that screen. Choose your version of firmware again, load firmware online, and now you can start clicking these boxes. So let's try it this time with no reboot sequence turned on. Okay, I got the same thing, so let's leave this page, go back, do the same thing. You don't need to turn on Flash on Connect. Basically, this will just automatically start flashing firmware once you plug in the USB cable, but we already have it plugged in, so we don't need it. This time I will turn on Full Chip Erase, flash firmware, got the same thing, change the screen, go back, choose firmware, load firmware online, and this time let's turn on manual baud rate, flash firmware, same thing. So now what I will do is unplug the USB cable, jump these pins again, plug the USB cable back in, go back to this page, and do the same thing. Now I'm going to cut to the chase because I already know what's needed, which is going to be these 3 boxes, and then flash firmware, and now it starts flashing. So I already knew what to do just because I've been using this flight controller for a long time, but the point that I'm trying to make is just try a bunch of random combinations, and also unplug your USB cable, plug it back in, and eventually it's going to work. The next thing you need to know is sometimes it will do flashing, and then once it gets halfway it will start verifying. Sometimes, oh, what do you know? I was just about to say that. Sometimes it will time out and say programming failed. Don't worry, that's, no cause for alarm. That actually happens quite often. So let's see if we have to unplug the USB cable. Nope, we don't. So we can just try again. Sometimes that will happen 3 or 4 times in a row, and you just have to keep doing it, and eventually it just works. These flight controllers are very finicky. Alright, let's see if it gets past verifying. It did not. So this time I'm going to unplug the USB and try it again that way. So once again I'm going to jump these pads, plug in the USB, and do it all over again. Finally, it made it. I actually had to try 2 more times off camera. I just fast forwarded through that when I edit this video, but yeah, point is it took me 4 tries. Programming successful. Now next thing you want to do, unplug the USB cable, click on the welcome screen, plug the USB cable back in, but this time do not jump the boot pads. We get the red status light, click connect, and we are now connected. And this build is done. Now let's move to the Omnibus, and this one is going to be a little bit more tricky because of the virtual COM port. For this one, we will just plug in the USB cable because we don't know what firmware is on it yet, and try to connect. And mine connected right away, so that means that this one came with Betaflight firmware on it. If you're not sure what version of Betaflight firmware is on it, go to CLI and just type in version and enter. And it has 3.1.7 firmware on it, so we are already up to date. But what if you are not? Actually, let me back up. What if it's not connecting for you? Because this is a huge problem that people have with the virtual COM port flight controllers. In that case, what you want is the Impulse RC driver fixer. You can just go to Google and search for that, and there's a few different websites where you can download this for free. Once you have this downloaded and installed, then just go ahead and plug in your USB cable, click on this. It's going to say entering bootloader, then installing DFU driver. Success, driver is fixed. So you can close this out, then go into Betaflight and try to, this is something else you need to know about virtual COM port flight controllers. On these, whenever you enter the bootloader mode, it shows DFU up here, where with the CP2102 flight controllers, it does not. The way you know you are in the bootloader with those boards is because the status light is not turned on. I think the status light is not turned on these either, but I'm just saying it says DFU up here. If it does say DFU, you cannot connect. In that case, just disconnect your USB cable, plug it back in. Make sure that the right COM port is selected, and then connect. If the Impulse RC driver fixer tool did not work, then I'm going to leave you a link in the description below. Watch that video and I show you how to go into the device manager and manually change the drivers on your flight controllers. And that's a surefire fix, so definitely watch that video if you do need additional help. As far as flashing firmware to these boards with the virtual COM ports, if it already has Betaflight firmware on it, then you actually don't have to enter the bootloader mode. By the way, just for future reference, with the Omnibus flight controller, it doesn't have pins that you have to jump with a piece of metal. It actually has a button located right here, this yellow thing. So you would just hold that button in and then plug in your USB cable. Actually, I'll show you real quick. So if I hold this button down, and I'm going to use a screwdriver because it is kind of hard to press, and then press the USB, or plug in the USB, and then we look at the top right of the screen, we see DFU, so that means I am in the bootloader. But I guess what I'm saying is, if it does not have Betaflight firmware on it, you will have to press that button down and enter the bootloader mode until it says DFU, then go to firmware flasher, and for these you do not have to have all these turned on. And for this one, this is the, what was it, Omnibus F4. So not Omnibus, not Omnibus F4 SD, just Omnibus F4. And then pick the newest version of firmware, load firmware online, and flash firmware. Okay, it flashed firmware. The next thing I want to tell you is, alright, so I'm not in the bootloader mode right now. This is just a normal working mode. Once you have Betaflight firmware on it, from here on out, you don't have to enter the bootloader anymore. All you do is just go to firmware flasher, pick the version, or pick your flight controller, the version of firmware, load firmware online, and then flash firmware, and it will automatically enter the bootloader mode and flash firmware. That's only after you put Betaflight firmware on it the first time. So if we connect, we see that it connects. And just a little FYI, the difference, how do you know if it has a virtual COM port or the CP2102 driver? If you click on ports, the boards with the virtual COM ports will say USB VCP. And then your either 1, 2, and 3 if it has a F3 processor, or 1, 3, and 6 if it has a F4 processor. If you plug in the Dodo and connect and then go to ports, you do not see USB VCP, and we see your 1, 2, and 3. And like I said in the last video, these boards with the CP2102 chipset, UART number 1 is tied into the USB, and for that reason you don't want to put any devices on UART number 1. And you have to leave MSP turned on. Do not turn this off because you will lock up your flight controller, and then you'll be watching my video on how to unlock your flight controller. Same thing goes for the virtual COM port flight controllers. Where it says USB VCP, you will see that MSP is turned on. Do not turn that off. Or like I said, you will lock up the flight controller and then you will have to unlock it. My shortened version of how to unlock a flight controller is pretty simple. You just flash new firmware, just make sure that full chip erase is turned on. So there's your shortened version of that other video that I made. And that's going to do it, guys. So hopefully you are all connected to Betaflight and we can continue from here. And that does it, guys. Now everyone should be connected to Betaflight and ready to go from here. So thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.